Dr. Jordan Peterson is the most interesting intellectual of 2016, 2017, and at the rate he's going, it might be 2018 too. He's making religious people atheist and even confused people stop to think. And whenever anyone can get an atheist to think, wow, I need to read more about the Bible and the myths and the sacred stories, and not to just critique them, but to actually learn something, you should be listening to this guy. That right alone should give us all pause to listen more to Dr. Jordan Peterson. But at the end of the day, his ideas give a great compliment to religion while at the same time ending up as atheist ideas. And when he was asked in a talk like, well, can you summarize your personal religious beliefs? And he said, I can't summarize them any shorter than essentially an undergraduate length class. And I'm going to try to actually summarize them shorter and give a concise meaning of what he means. And if I do violence to any part of it, please forgive me, Dr. Jordan Peterson. I think it's kind of like at the Catholic faith, you can summarize it in a 30-second Apostles' Creed, but at the same time, you could study your whole life on it and not exhaust it. We're going to do something like that here, and we're going to talk about the most important points he's making and also some critiques of those points. Dr. Peterson is a psychologist, and he basically argues that religion and myth are the deepest forms of psychology. In essence, they are the psychology that's been passed on by man from before the scientific method was even developed or the modern field of psychology was even developed. And that some of these lessons are being passed on by man are, Christian, but they're also even before the writing of the Bible. And that Jesus is the perfect man upon which a lot of what Western civilization and the assumptions and what we've built have been built upon, is this idea that Jesus is the perfect man. He also would argue that humanity first came on the scene like 200 million years ago, and we're not even aware of a time when humanity did not have religion. In the last 100 years or so, we've tried to kind of push religion out of society, and there's been kind of an active movement against religion. At that same time, we've also developed weapons that can basically annihilate our civilization, annihilate ourselves. And the question is, can we survive without religion? In fact, was this religion that's always been present that we're very recently trying to push away necessary for our survival, and maybe even more necessary now, because what's going to hold all the scientific advances that give humanity the new power to basically end the species? What's going to hold all that in check? None of this necessarily means that there is a God or even a supernatural religion. Religion is essentially, in this way of thinking, the formation we give ourselves to keep our species from self-destructing and to keep society from just disintegrating into cruelty and atrocity. This is a pretty novel approach for an atheist. Since ancient times, there's been atheists, and most of them kind of saw a sociological value in religion. They're like, well, we need religion to help kind of organize society, to help keep the masses kind of happy, to give people some meaning in their lives. But if you're sophisticated enough and you can handle it, then you can become an atheist. This is an ancient worldview also. It's not just something new that came up in the last 100 years. And in a sense, Karl Marx would agree with those old atheists, except he'd say it's just really evil to be, using religion that way for sociological purposes. That's part of just a way of keeping down the masses, the opium of the people, And so in a way, he's agreeing with the old atheists, but he becomes very anti-religion at the same time. What's kind of new about this perspective is instead of a sociological defense, it's a psychological defense. And it's kind of going against the arguments of what could be called the new atheists. If you look up new atheism, the primary thing is atheism today has become kind of evangelical. It's become anti-religion. It feels a need to spread itself and to push religion out, particularly of public discourse. Like maybe it's okay if the Amish believe in God or there's some little sect somewhere, but we shouldn't be basing laws on it. We shouldn't be justifying society on it. We need to push it out of all of that. And that's kind of this idea of the new atheism. And it's not that new. The term's new, but for over 100 years, atheism's been behaving this way. In fact, Chesterton has this quote where he goes, the disproof of modern atheism is how evangelical they are. This new way of kind of viewing religion that Dr. Peterson is supporting is a way to, in a sense, be atheist and pro-religion at the same time. even though I've just portrayed Dr. Peterson as an atheist, I'm not sure he'd call himself that. I think he might say that he believes in God. And he would say that he believes in God the same reason, or he'd say rather God is true for the same reason any psychological theory is true, is because it has great explanatory power and it helps someone or has a great effect or is useful. And the theory of God passes that test as being true. What he's going to deny is a certain transcendental truth to God that religion, and it's in the way we've all come to understand it so far, demands. To make his case, Dr. Peterson's taking 4 unpopular positions. All these positions go against some popular modern attitudes about things. And the really interesting thing to me is that all of these positions are very consistent with the Catholic Church, and it's not the first time someone has taken these positions, but he's defending them very well, and he's getting people interested, which is remarkable. The first position is that it's a popular attitude that religion and science are in this tension where they're actually opposed to each other. He would deny that. Although science may have caused some confusion in religion because it's been shown this amazing explanatory power and amazing just advances in quality of life over the last 200 years, it in fact isn't a philosophy per se. It's not something that was ever meant to explain everything in the world. What it really is a method. It's a way of discovery, a way of validating truth between people. And it actually was within the society, a Christian society in which this scientific method took off. And at the end of the day, these things are not opposed or either or. There's always been Christian scientists. There will always be Christians who do science. And in fact, you could almost argue that Christianity was the necessary foundation for science. The second thing he's going to argue is to not characterize religion as some twisted, manipulative tool that is just there to support ignorance and hurt people and keep people down. And he's going to move to a third point, which says that Christianity and Judaism are not essentially just the foundation of what we think of as science. They're actually the foundation of Western civilization. And in the last 100 years or so, we've taken a lot of efforts to push them outside Western civilization and create Western civilization independent of them. In doing that, you might be just cutting away all the foundation of Western civilization, and it's not clear how long Western civilization can sustain without that foundation. This is also kind of a repeat of the same critique Nietzsche was giving over 100 years ago. So the last thing he's going to argue that's kind of interesting is he's going to say, every man is haunted by a great capacity for evil. And there's not just like good people and bad people, but the worst atrocities are often done by just average people giving in to the worst part of themselves, and that this is actually empirically proven. Like when you see people in societies like the Mongolian invasions or the Nazi situation or the Soviet Russia, you see people who are just average people, not like psychologically sociopathic people doing atrocities, and this can only be explained in that there's a darkness in man that lends it to this. And how do we keep society in a sense from devolving into atrocities, and how do we keep man himself from devolving into atrocities? And that this is the role of religion, and it's the historical importance of religion to keep all that in check. I think the primary tricky thing and interesting thing about all of Dr. Peterson's theories is they're almost entirely consistent with religion. And from like a Catholic perspective, all these insights can be included as like good insights about religion. Catholicism, is fine with there being elements of evolved truth, metaphorical truth, psychology in the Bible, and all Catholic teachings, not just the Bible. And the Catholic Church is even okay recognizing truth discoveries in other religions and saying that things can kind of come from different backgrounds that are also true. All of that is fine within the Catholic faith. It just can't be taken to the extreme of denying certain supernatural realities or be given the emphasis of being the interpretive method for these sacred scriptures. So there's many things for Catholics to learn here, but I think we have to leave with like at least 4 different critiques of this approach. The first critique of Dr. Peterson's ideas is that it's taking a method too far, and that evolutionary psychology cannot be the primary interpretive method for sacred texts or teachings of the church. There's always a danger of becoming a slave to your method. Like if you explain things as dominance hierarchies of class or sex, you can actually use that intellectual method to explain almost everything and come up with some story about how everything is just that. It's more of an explanatory game than a quest for real truth. It's like people becoming a slave of their own methodology. And in this way, I think you can call this type of thinking a habit of thought or a virus or a thought virus, where you just kind of get in a rut where that's where you keep delving into as the thing to explain everything. I think that Dr. Peterson is open to this critique with regards to evolutionary psychology. An example of this in religion. There came about something called the historical critical method of biblical scholarship. And when it became very popular and it kept asking the question, what is the simplest natural explanation of this apparently supernatural event? In fact, the historical critical method could have been called the natural critical method, and it came into conflict with a supernatural view of the Bible. The best thinkers in there did not, but for a lot of people, that's just what it became. Instead of arguing the validity of supernatural claims in the Bible and like whether or not a supernatural thing could have happened, it just said, no, the supernatural claims are not true, and it tried to come up with the natural explanations that must be correct if anything's actually correct in the text. In my own experience, I've decided that the historical critical method is just not for me, but it keeps coming up in my mind all the time. It constantly distracts me, like when you're reading Moses going through the Red Sea and parting it, you're like, well, was it low tide? Was the wind at a 45-degree downward angle? Like, how did this actually happen? And really, that's almost meaningless for what real information and insight you're trying to get from the text. Dr. Peterson's evolutionary psychology approach has the same type of problem, but it's deeper than the historical critical method because it's always looking, in a sense, for the metaphor as opposed to the being open to the actual supernatural thing that could be happening. When overused, it can keep the reader from actually finding the biblical wisdom that really motivated the great saints and the great masters of religion. It holds you back because in a sense it has this like temptation of being more reasonable and keeping you from the more serious question of, is the supernatural stuff actually true? If you find Dr. Peterson's methodology the only compelling interpretive tool or the only valid one, then my critique isn't for you at all. But can that claim really be made? Can sacred texts and myths really be boiled down to just evolutionary psychology? And that goes into the second critique. And that is that religion has elements that are counterfactual to evolution. I'm not talking about Genesis, and I'm not trying to propose that. Evolution can be fine and true, but there's something tricky about evolution. And first, let's think about that. Evolution is kind of a problematic subject for scientific investigation. It isn't problematic because it isn't true. It's problematic because it isn't repeatable or directly observable. Building hypotheses using the logic of evolution is relatively easy. Finding a meaningful scientific test for any of those hypotheses is pretty difficult. If we, were in a different situation where somehow we could observe everything and we had 30-some plus independent runs of evolution, we could test quite a few different theories about it, about how it could evolve and different types of things we might expect. Without that, we don't have that power to observe 30 different independent human evolutions. We don't even have the power to really observe one. We have partial evidence about one with limited historical, which would be the very end of human evolution, and archaeological evidence. So if religion is to support the successful survival of the species, is there anything in religion that seems to be counter to that, And the one that screams out, and I'm sure Dr. Peterson has some answer to this because it screams out, it needs an answer, is that Jesus is a celibate and that he's killed. And why did he inspire so many, million women over the whole history of Christianity to live virginal lives, and not reproduce? To an evolutionist, it doesn't really matter if men don't reproduce, it just matters if the women don't reproduce. That's limiting. That's basically saying that this religion's creating genetic dead ends. In addition, Buddhism is doing the same thing with their monks. And this is no slam dunk refutation of all Dr. Peterson's thought, but observations like this, counterfactual observations like this, should create tension, and they shows the need for other explanatory tools besides just evolution in this. Secondly, the same can be said for man's capacity for evil, which is kind of at the center of Dr. Peterson's thought. Why did that evolve? How does this evil, the very evil we're trying to curtail through religion, help the species? If you can actually come up with an answer to that question, you may have solved an evolutionary problem. You would have explained evil as an evolutionary good thing, right? The problem is, in solving that evolutionary problem, you just blew up religion and the very thing that you're trying to say is valuable for the survival of mankind, because religion seems to take exactly the opposite position, that evil is not necessary and evil is not good for anything but even the survival of man. And in doing that, you kind of negate Dr. Peterson's whole premise that there's value here to be mined from religion. And that goes into the third critique, which is that there's something in Dr. Peterson's viewpoint that's contradicting his own sources of inspiration. My basic critique here is that Dr. Peterson is honoring and valuing all the wisdom that can be gained from the religious tradition while at the same time undermining the premise of it. And this is not unique to him. I once met someone who was getting a master's degree in spirituality, and it was from some type of seminary. And it wasn't a degree in religious studies. It wasn't a degree in comparative religion. And even though those degrees can be really annoying to religious people, there's a validity in that method. It, in fact, was a degree that tried to take all the masters of different religions and cull the wisdom from them. And, for example, St. Teresa of Avila is an example of someone in the Catholic faith that's a spiritual master. And if you went up to her and said, I don't believe in the sacraments, I don't believe in the Catholic teachings on Jesus, or really even fully believe in the supernatural, but I would like to learn some of your great insights and truths, she'd think you're cuckoo, because the only way she came to these insights and truths was building upon that foundation. And she'd be kind of right that that's a pretty silly thing to do. So at some level, when someone says, I want a master's degree in spirituality without buying into any religion, I think that's amazing. You know, like, it'd be great to go to all the masters, but it kind of ends up being a dabbler's thing that doesn't actually end in real insight. Part of that's because religion is different than a normal field of study. It's actually a process than just an area of study. Even though there's no hidden Catholic teachings that Jesus didn't say, all right, I'm going to hide these teachings or they're really far advanced. That's not what he did. It's actually, as much as it can be put on paper, the Christian faith is actually just spelled out and put on paper, and it's not hidden, it's publicly available. That's not enough to become a master at Christianity. In fact, you can know everything that's on the paper and still not get Christianity. It requires a certain moral practice, relationship development with fellow man and with God, both of those relationships. It requires sacraments and prayer to grow in the understanding of the religion. And you have to walk a path, if not, you could say you have to work a program to really advance in it. And it's the type of thing that someone quite dumb can out-excel someone quite smart. And this is not just some new way of thinking where it's like the modern way of just like live the question and walk the path. No, this is like Jesus. This is Jesus saying, I am the way. And the early Christian faith was called the way. It is, in fact, not the encyclopedia article of truth. It is the practice, the process of becoming closer and more spiritual with God and this truth. So I think that modern people see this in Eastern thought systems, and almost as a silly example, I think they see it like in martial arts. So that you can have like karate and taekwondo and judo, ad infinitum. I think there's a ton of them out there. And if someone came off the streets to you and said, yeah, you know, I sat in all the black belt lessons of every different martial art, I can honestly say I learned from the masters and I saw the highest level of each one and practiced it. That person would be kind of an idiot, because they'd know a lot more about it had they not gone to all those classes, but had even chosen one of those disciplines, started at the lowest level, worked their way up, and maybe when they're at the top, go and sample the others. It's kind of like perhaps a devoutly religious person of any faith will understand another devoutly religious person better than someone who's not religious. I would send a believing Jew to go negotiate with a Catholic nation or vice versa, or an Islamic nation, before I would send someone who just doesn't, in a sense, get or practice or have gone through the process of religion. This is also the wisdom behind the modern university. It's one of the only, I think it's the best defense of the modern university. You take one subject, you take your major or your graduate degree, and you take it seriously enough that you understand the serious research in that field. And if you can go one more step and actually reconstruct that research, duplicate it, or even come up with new research and execute it, then you've really understood the academic process. And once you've done that in one field, you're much more able to look at any other field and understand the complexity and what might have gone into what that field is working on. If you don't do that, it's kind of like taking a lot of freshman level courses and going down to the coffee shop to refine your ideas. You just don't get to the same place. And coffee shops are more needed at universities. You can't have a good university without a good coffee shop. And I don't mean Starbucks. I mean pre-Starbucks, place where people go and be idiots and talk through ideas and make weird claims. That is a very good thing. But it's not the same thing as getting an academic education. So the critique I'm making here is that if you take this, accept the sacred texts and the masters of any of these monotheistic religions, but you dismiss all the supernatural claims, it's unlikely you're going to get the real gold out of these religions, because you've undermined the foundation of those sacred texts and the masters while trying to still say that you're going to get some great discovery in them. The greatest supernatural claim that Christianity is making is that you enter into a relationship with an all-good, all-powerful Father, even a daddy, God. It's a personal relationship because you're both persons. That's kind of a crazy concept. And like all relationships, it goes up and down, and you have to spend time developing that relationship. It isn't like superpowers bestowed on gifted people. It's more like marriage and family. And if you reduce that relationship to an imaginary friend, something that's only useful, a psychological crutch per se, or maybe not crutch, psychological tool to get further and promote the species, you actually undermine the masters of that craft. You're so fundamentally disagreeing with them that it's weird to also think you're going to find gold in their writings. The gold you hope to find in those writings is, in fact, the meaning of life. And that goes into my fourth critique, that is, contrary to Dr. Peterson's claims, this evolutionary psychology approach cannot give that significant meaning to life. And I really enjoy Dr. Peterson's approach to meaning, because he puts it out there like a dare. He says that you have to basically choose in life between living a meaningless life that comes with no responsibility, or taking on a meaningful life where everything, in fact, is very important. He says that basically it's more attractive to accept meaninglessness. When you accept meaninglessness, what else do you have to do besides search for some earthly happiness and comfort? But if you accept a meaningful life, you're accepting grave responsibility. Meaninglessness comes with no responsibility. Meaning comes with responsibility, and it actually means that everything you do matters. And people, I think, are responding to Dr. Peterson and like this. They want that challenge. Even though he said it's, in a sense, harder or worse or sounds like a headache, people want it, The problem is, I actually think this contradicts Christianity. Before we talk about the critique of Christianity's idea of meaning versus Dr. Peterson's, I want to take an aside. Dr. Peterson is a psychologist, and he's trying to help people. And that's a very good thing. And I've listened to hours and hours of his lectures, but I haven't yet heard him talk about Viktor Frankl. And I know he must, because it almost seems like he's inspired by a lot of the thoughts of Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl, in his Man's Search for Meaning, talks about how he helps people who are seriously depressed as a psychologist, just like Dr. Peterson. And one of the things he does is when people are deeply depressed, he helps them find any meaning at all. If their meaning is to send their kids to school and feed them when they get home, praise be to the Lord, give them that meaning, let them grab onto it, and let them live another day. I don't want to be commenting on that. God bless psychologists. That's very good work. I'm going to talk about more bigger type of meaning question, right? And that's what Dr. Peterson's talking about overall with his theory, is a bigger, deeper meaning than that. More, but let's not, dismiss the need for any meaning someone can grab onto when they're in a crisis. Okay, the Christian difference in attitude about meaning is, instead of saying that meaninglessness is the easy path and meaningfulness is the hard path, they're going to reverse that. A meaningless life is a heavy burden. So for some reason, man desires purpose, desires this relationship with God. And if you don't have that, or you don't believe in that, you kind of default into comfort and happiness as the clear purpose. It's kind of your meaningless meaning is comfort and happiness. And unfortunately, life will hit you with discomfort and unhappiness. And if a really negative life event happens, drug addiction, a death, a breakup, you're betrayed, or something that is going to threaten your comfort and your happiness, you're in a really bad place if you are in a meaningless place. Because when comfort and happiness is destroyed through any of these events, life's going to get really tough for anyone. But for the meaningless person, you're hit twice as hard, because with it comes this psychological and spiritual disaster. The thing that you were just kind of thinking was what you were searching for. In a sense, your meaning's gone, even though it's kind of a meaningless meaning. Your meaning's gone along with the tragic life event. And meaning is exactly what you need when life gets tough. Christianity, therefore, thinks of meaning as light and comparatively easy to living without meaning. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you are weary and burdened, ... for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The responsibility of Christians is actually not a heavy responsibility. It's a light responsibility, and it's where you actually will receive rest, not be worn out by this. And you see people who do get worn out by it. It's scrupulosity and things like this, but that's not a truly Christian attitude. So in the Christian worldview, having meaning is actually easier than not having meaning. In a worldly sense, you can see this where someone joins like a startup company, and they know what they're working for, and you can compare them to someone who's working in maybe a company that's older, that's a little bit set in its ways, where people are always watching the clock. The startup people are working harder than the people watching the clock, but it doesn't feel as hard. And they wouldn't trade positions with the person who's watching the clock, because of that meaning is making all that work easier. I don't think this is the real disagreement with Dr. Peterson. I'm almost suspicious that Dr. Peterson just uses reverse psychology to get people to go after meaning by just telling them it's tough, because people like to be challenged that way. I think that the real problem comes with the meaning that evolutionary psychology implies. Dr. Peterson argues that people need to embrace religious teaching so they don't succumb to their dark desires, and so society doesn't descend into the types of evil illustrated by the Soviet Gulag, Nazi Germany, the concentration camps. And I think he's right about these points. There's no problem with that. And he may even support a further reason. He said he might think that, argue that perhaps you need to embrace religious truths so that you can play your best role for the health of humanity, and that you may be hardwired for happiness if you play that role. The better you, in a sense, serve your survival and survival of the species, the happier you are going to be. In essence, this is the meaning he's proposing. Do your part for the survival of the species and the prevention of heinous acts by humanity, and by doing your part, you'll be happier. The problem is that there isn't enough meaning there to fill the human heart and soul. Joe Rogan is a noted atheist, and I'll change one word in his quote, but I like this quote. He was talking about an evolutionary advance, and he says, "That happened, just keep this stupid party going." And if it's just a stupid party, why do we want to keep it going? There's just not meaning there, right? I myself couldn't, if I thought this was just one big stupid party and my role was to just keep this stupid party going, I just couldn't get myself to do very much. We need meaning, that we need love, and we need that love in all its forms to be more than a biological construct for our survival. We need love to be divine. It needs to be to have a greatness that surpasses procreation, survival, and saving others. If it doesn't, many people, including myself, would be sitting in our basement playing video games, or worse, venting our embarrassing dark side for some illogical pleasure that we receive from doing evil. And it's meaning that keeps us from doing that, and it can't merely be a meaning of material reality to do that. The Christian claim that I hold to is that love is the author of the universe, that divine love is so great and an all-powerful being is humbled and even tortured, and that you have immediate access to that love regardless of your lowly circumstances or tragedy. And if you choose to accept relationship with God, the perfect love, all things work for your good, for your eternal good, not just for like a good in this life or psychological good, and for the triumph of that love. This is the Christian claim that stands against a merely biological claim or evolutionary claim. And it's the real claim of religion that isn't even approached or disproven given an evolutionary psychology approach. But it's why evolutionary psychology as an approach to religion is always secondary and complementary to the highest meaning in religion. Please comment, like, subscribe, do whatever you want to this video. Dr. Peterson, if you happen to hear this video, please excuse anything I overlooked or misconstrued. I'd be honored for any response you want to give at all. If you're interested in this type of analysis, please subscribe to the Foolish Catholic podcast on iTunes, or you can look for the Foolish Catholic playlist within the Simple House YouTube channel. If you're curious about my day job or the work of Simple House, please visit simplehouse.org.